The principal reason for the roundtable was to look at how we can define and measure efficiency in an appropriate level of detail and with appropriate data to enable policymakers in particular to take informed decisions about future policy changes that they may wish to make, and also to look at past reforms, whether it be structural reforms, regulatory reforms, or other policy initiatives that have been undertaken. So that was a principal purpose, and that was the opening question that we asked to delegates at the start of the roundtable. In answer to that question, we had a series of presentations from experts from around the world, and they encompassed presentations on particular balanced scorecard of efficiency and effectiveness indices. And so this is looking at things like productivity indices. It's looking at financial indices. It's looking at indices which look at the intensiveness of use of the network. So a whole series of different indicators. What was said during that presentation was that the indicators will never be perfect. So there's no perfect answer. But what the indicators can do is provide a pattern, can provide some indicative results and conclusions as to levels of efficiency and effectiveness of the different railways. But what's important is that we must, if we want to do country-specific analysis, we must dig deeper into the reasons for differences between different packages of indices. So we must understand the country-specific railway structure, regulatory environment, incentive frameworks, as well as the technical aspects of the railways themselves. So the narrative that underpins the indices is very important. Otherwise, if we had a simple ranking of indices between different countries, we could give a very misleading picture to policymakers and regulators. Another presentation, which in a sense is a more sophisticated way of looking at efficiency, was an econometric modelling, whereby key cost drivers are put into a model to determine the cost. And the advantage of econometric models is that we can vary or we can understand variations in cost as a result in variations in those cost drivers. And we can also understand relative cost efficiency between either different railway operators or infrastructure managers. So it can be very powerful, and indeed I used it myself as a regulator when I was at the Office of Rail Regulation to understand where Network Rail sat in terms of cost efficiency relative to other infrastructure managers. Now, we do have to be cautious about the use of such techniques. It does have its limitations and challenges. And we heard a few examples during the roundtable of those challenges. One is accounting for differences in quality of outputs. So, for example, different levels of safety, different levels of reliability, punctuality. And so outside of the model, if they can't be incorporated, you do have to try and understand what differences in cost are being driven by the quality of outputs. We also debated issues around levels of infrastructure renewals, whereby it can seem as a railway infrastructure manager might look efficient on the basis of low renewals costs, but that can be a result that its expenditure on renewals is less than the steady state requirements to maintain the railway in good condition over the life of the assets. And equally, it may be a railway is having to spend more money on its assets renewing its assets because of underinvestment previously. So we have to be very careful about how we interpret the results of econometric modelling, and it does require a lot of good quality data as well. So there was some reaction from delegates about the complexity of such an approach, and really being careful about how we interpret the results. We then heard about, I would call more of an engineering based approach to understanding differences in costs, and this was specifically related to ProRail in the Netherlands, and we saw how some of the performance of the railways in the Netherlands had improved significantly following vertical separation of infrastructure from operations. We saw how, on the face of it, some of the costs seemed to have increased, but we heard that largely that was a result of a change in financial accounting. Financial accounting on a much more commercial basis, whereby the assets are valued on a replacement or renewal basis rather than on a historic basis. But by and large, the restructuring in the Netherlands seems to be successful on many measures. We were given some examples of how the Netherlands ProRail had benchmarked their maintenance costs against the US and against Japan in particular. And we were given a detailed briefing as to what the causes of the differences between the unit costs in the Netherlands were compared to the US. So again, on the face of it, the Netherlands maintenance costs were significantly higher than those in the US. But we heard that that's largely due to the complexity of the network. Far more switches, higher intensity of use of the network, many other examples. And what they tried to do in the Netherlands is, again, develop a model less sophisticated than the econometric model, but nevertheless along the same sort of lines to explain the key drivers of differences in cost. So what we ended up with was what I would consider complementary approaches to assessing efficiency and effectiveness of different railways. And I think that they can be used in combination, and again, depending on the questions being asked, depending on the quality of data that is available. And that brings me to the quality of data, because there was some discussion, particularly around consistency of quality of data in European countries. And although the UIC does collect and tries to ensure consistency of data across its members across the EU, it was acknowledged that it's not perfect and it needs to improve. And one of the issues that we discussed was that one of the reasons that there isn't a consistent quality data set across the European railways is because there is no mandated requirement for them to provide that information. It's provided largely on a voluntary basis. Now, some regulators in the EU, including the UK, do have quite a detailed list of data requirements for the infrastructure manager in particular, but this is not consistent across the EU. Now, in the absence of a European regulator, one of the ideas that we had was that perhaps the national regulators could get together and could develop a template of information which would enable them to do international comparisons of efficiency much more easily, whether it be through the more simple indices, metrics, or whether it be through the more sophisticated econometric modelling techniques. So in terms of data availability, perhaps that's something that the regulators could look at in the EU.